this morning will be by David Aldous from the University of Berkeley, or California, Berkeley, I guess I should say. And your title isn't up there, so look very quickly. There it is, some broad questions about the tree of life.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come back to Cambridge, where I sort of spent my student days. Somebody already used the, and now for something completely different line, but along that theme, I basically, what's important to say right up front is that what I'm talking on is sort of not the topic of this workshop. I guess I'll make that clear. And secondly, that the point of my talk is to ask questions rather than answer them, so there isn't a bottom line. Okay, so again, the way I look at it is the sort of topic of this workshop, kind of technical aspects of estimating trees from molecular data, kind of an analog to conducting a national census. There's just a lot of sort of legwork, vast numbers of person years go into this. There are technical questions in how you do it and how accurate the results are. But at the end of the day, the census takes a year. Maybe we're going to have another 20 years of reconstructing the tree of life. But at the end of this time, we're going to have a sort of essentially accurate tree, and this is an interesting data set, and the question is, suppose we have the right tree of life, that's a huge amount of data, what, if anything, is that telling us? So that's the kind of conceptual question I'm asking about. You assume we know a lot. What does it tell us about the sort of mechanism of biological evolution? There are lots of aspects one could think about. Here, just to focus on kind of a textbook one, adaptive radiation. So, have a son doing, in high school in California, and 10th grade biology. Have a section on adaptive radiation. So, I assume you know what it is. That the familiar large clades that have common names, birds, spiders, mammals, beetles, etc. No one doubts that adaptive radiation is the correct explanation of those. The trouble is that once you've got an explanation that explains some things, there's always a temptation to use it to explain everything. If I just see 3 closely related species, one's instinct is to just say, well, that's an adaptive radiation of 3 species. And now you kind of get this problem of, well, if something explains everything, is that really different from explaining nothing? So, theories of everything sort of aren't entirely convincing. So, what part of the tree of life is adaptive radiation, and what is something else, and what might something else be? So people have thought about this, and there's sort of various papers. So cut and paste. I just cut and pasted someone's abstract here, and you can read as fast as I can. So instead of, or you can read faster than I can talk. So I'm just going to let you read through the sort of page-and-a-half abstract from Testing Adaptive Radiation and Key Innovation Hypotheses in Spiders. For a second. So we'll get to see some new words here, a bit of education experience here. Anyway, so here's the sort of bottom line on my comment. So firstly, spider phylogeny, they've got 34,000 species. So essentially what they're doing, they've got a tree. I mean, they're using other people's trees on 34,000 species. They're kind of looking at 74 bifurcating nodes. So they're looking at the sort of top part of the tree, and they found 74 binary nodes there. They're looking at sort of balance of subtrees. At each node you have 2 daughter clades. Somewhat arbitrarily, of course, no mathematician or statistician would do it quite this way because you're throwing away data, but somehow the biologists are kind of arbitrarily saying for each split we call them unbalanced if it's worse than 90%, 10% split, balanced if not. So they've just counted the number of these binary splits that are unbalanced, 31 over 74. Under the usual null model, there's a kind of uniform distribution of splits. So under the usual null model, sort of only a fifth of these would be unbalanced, which would be whatever that is, 15 out of 74. 31's a lot bigger than 15 under any sort of a significance test. So the the splits in this tree are sort of more unbalanced than the usual probability models would say. And so they've done that level of analysis is kind of perfectly sensible. In particular, they're doing it by actually counting numbers of species in clades rather than number of genera, etc., which other people have done, but which raises all sorts of other issues I'll touch upon later. So this is one of many such papers like this, which show that reconstructed trees are typically more unbalanced than simple models would predict. And of course, then they sort of sneak in the middle here. Therefore, some of the diversity can be attributed to some deterministic cause, e.g. adaptive radiation. And of course, we're now sort of getting into, what we teach in freshman statistics. The first issue is that a null hypothesis of some simple stochastic model is just intrinsically implausible. Evolution is more complicated than that, as somebody said. So kind of doing tests of significance is really just sort of demolishing a straw man, because no one would believe it was literally true in the first place. And then the second logical issue of freshman stat is that just because you've got deviations from a null model, you simply can't attribute that to any particular cause without a lot more work. So even saying this has some deterministic cause just isn't right. It just means that it might be some other stochastic model different from the one you thought of, and even if there's a deterministic cause, attributing to this to some real-world effect like adaptive radiation is just kind of silly. So there's, biologists have thought about this question, but there's no literature I've seen that kind of stands up to 30 seconds of analysis, in terms of, yes, it's true that trees are unbalanced. One can think of 57 possible explanations for what that might be caused by, and trying to sort of identify any of this sort of statistical analysis with something concrete like adaptive radiation, no one's succeeded in doing, and I don't know how to do it. So there's this sort of very fundamental question you could say about evolution, that if you knew the true tree of life, and then if you set aside sort of identifiable particular events like mass extinctions, so I'm kind of looking at the overall statistical structure of the tree rather than particular aspects of it, undoubtedly some parts of the tree you see adaptive radiation, but is there anything else going on? And nobody, including me, knows how to do that. So it's kind of a question people are aware of, but don't really know what to do. Okay, so what am I doing? So I'm telling you what I'm not doing here. So I have a very slow ongoing project with a former student, Leah Popovich, and postdoc Maxime Krajkan. What we have on our webpage is 2 finished math papers. What we're working on slowly, and Mike Steele offers money prizes for things. I'm just going to offer a pint of beer prize. So I need an actual title for a paper I'm working on, and the actual content is the description of the paper, and what I'm going to talk about is this 5 observations or questions for biologists arising out of the mathematical work above. So that's literally what I'm going to talk about, but how to spend a long time trying to make a title out of that, and I can't do it. So if anyone can do that. Okay, so what are my 5 questions? And they're sort of summarized. I wrote them in chalk here for memory. Again, these are sort of slightly haphazard, not necessarily the most important things in the big scheme of things, but they're kind of oddities that have come to mind, spotlighting implicit assumptions. So imagine we have a clade on N. Again, I take 23 as my generic N. I have a clade with 23 living species. What happened historically to that clade? Well, it kind of started with 1 species sometime in the past, and then the number of species coexisting at times in the past has sort of fluctuated somehow from 1 originally to 23 now. So there's some maximum number m that we ever saw at one time, which a priori is at least as large as the current number n. And the issue is sort of what, in some kind of statistical sense, what are plausible values or implausible values for the ratio m over n? What would be not unusual, and what would be sort of unusual and require some specific biological explanation? That's just a question. Second issue, again, we have our living clade on 23 trees, and suppose I have the right phylogeny, meaning the right lineage tree. I know that these lineages coalesced 3.4 million years ago, etc. Suppose I have that and it's correct. Again, of course, suppose we don't have any fossil record for the extinct species in the clade. Again, there's been some historical process of speciation and extinction, and one can think of that as having speciation and extinction rates. Of course, the idea of adaptive radiation is that you start off with a kind of large speciation rate, and then it slows down. But what can one deduce from a true tree? How well can one estimate past speciation and extinction rates? The other question is that, you look at a current species, it's descendant from some ancestor species. That ancestor species may not be still around. So what percentage of sort of parents of existing species are still alive rather than being extinct? Again, what is that as an empirical fact, and how does it compare with the predictions of the little probability models we know and love? My third question. Fourth question, getting kind of slightly technical, the sort of deep past fossil record you just can't resolve down to the species level. There's a lot of data about this, but the data tends to be counts for genera, families, some higher order. And so there are kind of issues in how, it's like technical, there are issues in how reliable this data is. And one thing a probability model can in principle do for you is kind of give theoretical estimates of kind of random effects of randomness at different levels of the taxonomic hierarchy, and if we get there I'll explain a bit further. Also the fifth one again is the tree balance, the tree imbalance effect. Even when you look at trees on species, there's some, they tend to be more imbalanced than one would expect from a simple chance model. That I don't have any particular insight into, but a related question is, again, when you're looking at, say, fossil data, and your data is at the level of family or genera, and you construct trees on those, you also see things that are sometimes getting more unbalanced. And the question is this increase in unbalance an actual biological phenomenon, or could it be just something about the artifact that we're drawing trees on these sort of entities, genera, families, which sort of are actually logically different from species, and so there may be something odd going on here at a mathematical level rather than at a biological level. So that's my kind of agenda here, and actually I suppose I can exploit my, at some point I'm going to get totally confused because I didn't plan on how to use three things efficiently, but let me just leave one up there and maybe it'll be useful later. Okay. So at the moment I'm going to kind of explain very briefly the little sort of math model for species, which is simple. Again, famous paper of Ewell 1924, which I sort of like to quote for many different reasons. Maybe I'm the only person who's ever read this paper. Anyone else in this room ever read Ewell's paper? Anyone claims to do it? 1, 2, very good, 3. Okay, so I'm not the only one. 3 people have read it. It's kind of interesting in many ways. So people study these models for speciation. I'm going to flash up 3 data trees from a paper of Wallenberg. Let me flash these up here. And what they're doing is the authors are using these to sort of illustrate qualitatively different biological stories. So they're treating this as a kind of an early radiation, and then not much happening more recently. So it's sort of radiation followed by stasis of some kind. Here they're thinking of a kind of more steady, ongoing speciation, kind of steady expansion of a clade. And here they're thinking of a kind of more recent exploration, some sort of initial slow expansion, which is sort of speeding up more recently. So these are just sort of 3 haphazard. They're totally, it's cranes, columbines, and Drosophila. They have nothing to do with each other. They're just little trees they happen to have at hand. I'm going to show some simulations, 3 different simulations of the model I'm about to talk about. the time scales sort of vary radically. So this is one sort of fairly early diversification. This is showing some more steady diversification, and this is indicating to me a little more recent rapid diversification. Basically, I sort of ran 10 simulations of the same model, and I've sort of picked out 3 that show quite different sorts of behavior. I could pick out another 3 that showed 3 different behaviors in some kind of orthogonal direction to these. So that my sort of first conceptual point is that there's a model I'm about to talk about, which I'm certainly not going to say is plausible or true in any absolute sense, but seems intuitively as plausible as other models people do study, but which has this feature of just a lot of variability from one realization to another. And since for any clade, all the data you have is sort of one realization of the tree, it makes me sort of very skeptical about people's attempts to infer biological cause from what's going on in sort of one particular clade. So let's see what we're doing here. Here's the model briefly. Again, there aren't any x's and y's in this talk. Again, I want a model for sort of what a tree on a given number n equals 23 extant species would look like if the past process of speciation and extinctions were completely random. So it's not clear what completely random means. So this is my model in words: conditioned continuous time critical branching. So it's critical in the sense that extinctions or speciations happen at the same rate, and we can kind of standardize that rate to 1, which basically means our time unit is mean species lifetime. So we have this critical branching, speciation, or extinction, and then the slight variation on the usual models, and I'll say this in Bayesian language, is that I'm starting with one species, but at a random time uniform on 0 to infinity in the past, which of course is the improper prior, but then I'm conditioning on this given number, n equals 23, species at the present time, and this conditioning gets us back to a probability model as a posterior. Now I should emphasize that I'm not doing Bayesian statistics here. I mean, this is just defining a probability model. It's just because the Bayesian languages of prior and posterior is natural here. And again, so the issue is that we're not putting in any built-in tendency for the number of species to increase or decrease, although obviously the fact that we are conditioning on a particular number means that it has increased from 1 to the current number, but that's a kind of posterior effect rather than a prior effect here. So this is, of course, a pretty simple one. Again, conceptually, this is the third model you think of. The 2 standard models are Yule's model, which is just speciation without extinction at all, and then the coalescent type models where you're just thinking of the total size of the clade, the total number of species in the clade being constant in time, but you sort of randomly pick one species to go extinct and one to speciate. And all these three models are sort of easy to do explicit calculations with, and one can do the same sorts of calculations in these models as in the other 2, which are kind of scattered through the literature. Just to show what the whole process looks like, and I have a bunch of these simulations up on a web page. Again, I'm showing everything. So I'm showing extinct species. I'm drawing trees in a slightly odd way with sort of daughters displaced a lot. This is n equals 20. So this is one realization of the model which is made to end up with 20 species here. The sort of time unit is sort of 1 mean species lifetime. This happened, the clade originated at time 12.75. The most recent common ancestor is back at time 9. Of course, important to keep in mind that origins of clades are before the most recent common ancestor of living species. The number, the sort of curve on the left is the time series of number of species as a function of time. It starts at 1, ends up at 20, but it has a maximum of 38 in this realization. Again, we conditioned on having 20 living species as a random number of extinct species, which in this case was 142. So this is kind of the, a complete realization of everything that's going on in the model. And of course now we can sort of simplify down. This is just the kind of evolutionary history of the extant species, but kind of showing their ancestors as actual species with sort of origination times and extinction times. And then of course we can go from that to the previous lineage trees, or what you're used to thinking of as phylogenetic trees, where we just see lineages and we don't identify the lineages with actual extinct species. Okay, and I thought about writing out 10 different formulas for things we can calculate within this model, and I'm just not going to do it. It's not terribly exciting to throw up formulas, but sort of most of the things you might think of as that you want to calculate in terms of this model one can do. Being math probabilists, we tend to be lazy and think about elegant formulas for n to infinity asymptotics rather than complicated exact formulas for finite n. One could do the latter if one wanted to. For most of the things we're talking about, again, logically, sort of big clades, for many reasons, this sort of pure chance model is kind of totally unrealistic for large clades, so one should really only sort of think of these as sort of plausible models for smallish clades. In that sense, it's a bit fake to be doing n to infinity asymptotics, but the approximations are reasonably good wherever we've checked. So one can get sort of analytical expressions for sort of time series of number of species, for things like numbers of extinct species, for kind of the shape of the tree relative to extant or extinct species, in times the most recent common ancestors. So most of the things you think about we can calculate analytically, at least as approximations. So we have the kind of our pure chance model. We get a bunch of formulas. What's the bottom line? And again, the first thing I'm emphasizing is this sort of variability of realizations. It's something that sort of theoretical probabilists or statistical physicists are familiar with, that in many contexts, if you have some stochastic process with a parameter in it, well, the parameter here is sort of speciation rate divided by extinction rate, then in many cases, where the parameter is at a critical value, one in this case, the sort of processes just have more variability than at non-critical values, and sort of my point, again, illustrated by sort of flashing up 3 realizations earlier, is that because pure chance can make trees look very different, it's very dangerous to try and make an inference about biological mechanism from your just one realization of a tree. I can sort of amplify that in 2 different ways. Here you actually have to listen to me because I did a terrible job of, I copied this from a paper and the slide doesn't actually explain what anything is here. Okay, the lazy man's thing. So again, I've taken 10 realizations of the model, and I've looked at three statistics for each. On the x-axis is the time of origin in some standardized units. The y-axis is the time to the most recent common ancestor, of course a priori less than that. The third thing, just for fun, is the sort of number of species alive at the time of the most recent common ancestor. And again, my point is that over 10 realizations, the first 2 things vary by a factor of 10, kind of in terms of times of origin in standardized units goes from about 0.5 to 5. Similarly for the time of most recent common ancestor. And the actual, this sort of final quantity, number of species alive at the time of the most recent common ancestor actually varies by a factor of about 50 over these 10 realizations. And so that's a sort of dramatic instance of variability, and put it into words. You think about mammals, the origin of mammals was way back in the first half of the dinosaur age. No one's quite sure where the most recent common ancestor of living mammals was. No one's very sure where that was. But if you ask how many different mammal species were around there, well, in this sense, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 500. Each is a priori plausible if you don't have any other data. So that there's just sort of, the evolution is random and variable. If you believe that somehow that sort of things aren't kind of growing exponentially fast, and somehow as a matter of logic, at most periods in times, the number of species can't be growing exponentially fast, otherwise we'd have too many species now. Okay. Where are we going? So here's a final thing. I'm sort of beating this one to death, but it's a little simulation exercise. So a common model people look at, so when people try and take data on, again, a phylogenetic tree on a living species and try and estimate past speciation and extinction rate, they take a little birth and death model. So they take a 3-parameter model, some unknown time of origin of the clade, some unknown speciation rate, some extinction rate. So you can just use your data to estimate, say, as maximum likelihood estimates, what these parameters are. So I've done that, but again, instead of doing it on biological data, I've done it on 10 realizations from my model. And what you have to keep in mind is that my model has lambda and mu equals 1, but it has this sort of different, this sort of, for once there's actually a kind of difference between Bayesian and frequentists. These people are being frequentists and say T star is a sort of unknown fixed number, and I'm being a Bayesian and saying it's a random number. And when you do the MLEs separately for each realization, one gets these sort of dramatically varying and somehow wrong answers. The maximum likelihood estimator of mu, which is really 1, is usually around 0.2 or 0.3. Maximum likelihood estimator of speciation rate, again, which is really 1, again, it's all over the map, but typically often a lot less than 1. The time of most recent ancestor, of course, we observe in our phylogenetic tree, etc. But the estimates, the MLE estimates for the time of origin, tend to be always around 10% further back than the most recent common ancestor, whereas the actual time of origins in our simulations are widely varying. So of course there's nothing sort of inconsistent with statistical theory here. Statistical theory says somehow that MLEs are good most of the time, but that's of course assuming that you have the right model. So of course I'm sort of applying estimates from one model to data from another model, so there's nothing sort of paradoxical about the fact that one doesn't get sensible answers. But the point is that if you're trying to study adaptive radiation by this sort of method, then whether adaptive radiation is happening or not is roughly sort of whether lambda is less than mu, or whether lambda is systematically bigger than mu or not. And basically, in all these realizations, you're doing an analysis and showing that lambda is a lot bigger than mu, but it isn't. It's coming from a model where lambda and mu are actually the same. And again, this is just the sort of hazards of trying to make statistical inference from this sort of data, and there's chunks of literature that says you can estimate speciation extinction rates in this way, but unless you have some a priori reason to believe that this sort of model is true, and that you really are seeing an adaptive radiation, to me these types of analysis just don't make much sense at all, because what you see in the adaptive radiation case is sort of not different from what you see in a sort of pure noise model. And I did this with n equals 8, and you might think this is a small sample effect, but it's kind of not. You'd see the same thing however large n would be. The sort of randomness doesn't average out as n gets large. So let me take the same idea in a slightly different direction. I'm going to throw up 2 slides which say almost the same thing, and one is my summary of some bunch of some evolutionary controversy, and here's sort of someone else's kind of throwaway phrase. So, again, looking at the big picture of evolutionary history, there's sort of debate between two schools, the kind of logistic growth school and the sort of exponential growth school. That one is saying that the kind of reason there are 9,000 species of birds rather than 10 times more or 10 times less is that, well, firstly, being a bird is a good idea. There's an adaptive radiation from the first species, and that they then sort of just spread out until they filled every possible niche for birds, and then they're staying at a level kind of controlled by ecological niches, so kind of logistic curve for number of species as a function of time. And the other kind of a story is somehow species as technology growth, that somehow we're in a world where we think that technology will grow exponentially forever because each new technology allows sort of further future technologies to take place. There's another view that clades sort of make sort of ecology is more complicated, and as you make ecologies more complicated, you just kind of go on creating new possible niches for species sort of forever. And of course, none of these things last forever, but they last until some external factor intervenes here. And again, so that's some philosophical argument here. May's former president of the Royal Society. So these are serious people, and part of an abstract of some paper is over there. And the sentence I want to focus on is, these extremes bracket the plausible dynamical history of real clades. So either the sort of exponential growth that Yule was talking about, or the constant size coalescent type model. So there's a sort of presumption in some chunk of this bit of math biology that these are the opposite extremes. And of course, in a certain sense, they are opposite extremes, but in another sense, they're the same extreme. If I want to go back to my second question, I want to think for a clade of n extant species, what's the sort of ratio of the maximum number of species alive simultaneously at some time in the past over the current number? And of course, in both of these models, that will be close to 1, whether it's constant number or growing number. We're getting this ratio close to 1, and so there's this sort of huge area which kind of just assumes, without thinking about it, that this is close to 1, despite the fact, of course, there are sort of very specific, well-known examples of clades like horses or rhinoceroses, etc., where fossil record shows R isn't 1. It turns out our model has a cute property. There's a sort of hidden martingale somewhere, and the hidden martingale tells us that this formula for the chance of R, the chance that it's bigger than 2 is a half, the chance that this ratio is bigger than 10 is a tenth, etc. And of course, this prediction for the distribution of R is sort of very different from the biologist's implicit assumption that R is mostly close to 1. So again, this is an interesting question that biologists sort of just haven't thought about. I mean, of course, in a sense, it's an unanswerable question because in order to estimate R, you'd need a fairly complete fossil record. So there's a reason they haven't thought about it. But still, it's the job of mathematicians is to unearth these things. To me, there's a sort of supposition that R is around 1, and very little evidence that this is true as data, and again, very little sort of theoretical reason to think it might be true. People like Stephen Jay Gould, of course, emphasized back in the 70s and 80s this type of fluctuation of clade sizes, but it seems to have been sort of mostly ignored by professional biologists since then. Okay, here's another odd thought implicit. If you look up polar bears somewhere, you'll see that polar bears are generally believed to have originated fairly recently, 100 to 250,000 years ago, as a daughter species of brown bears. And that's sort of remarkable because if you look up almost any other animal you can think of, you won't see this effect. That if you look up lions and tigers, you'll see that there's a genus lion, leopard, jaguar, tiger, closely related. but they're believed to have descended from an extinct common ancestor maybe 5 million years ago, or these estimates are very rough, and anything else you look up will be in this category. It's sort of descended from an extinct ancestor. There used to be another well-known example which has disappeared. It used to be thought that dogs were a daughter species of wolves. It should count, but of course they've decided that dogs are now the same species as wolves, because of course they can interbreed. So that example went away, and there are no other common examples of species with whose sort of parent species is still around. So there's a data question: what proportion of species have some ancestor species extant? Again, no biologist has ever seems to have thought about this, but it's kind of clear, because it's clear that biologists sort of kind of assume this is around 0. People don't draw phylogenetic trees where you see here's a living species and here's an ancestor species up in the tree. On the other hand, any simple stochastic model that people use gives a value of half or something, and it just depends on the actual number, depends on the details of the model, which of course are arbitrary and aren't supposed to be exact. But still, if you have a number that's a priori between 0% and 100%, and if your model, all your models predict 50%, and if biologists actually assume the answer is 0%, there's something bizarre going on here. If you had this in population genetics, if you had a theory of population genetics that said that half the human beings, 50% of human beings should show some effect, and actually 0% of them show this effect, you'd be sort of worried about your theory, but somehow this effect in evolution sort of nobody notices, or either maybe everyone else notices and doesn't want to talk about it. So there's this sort of bizarre disconnect between stochastic models and what seems to be true. Again, my conclusion is sort of nag biologists about this, because the answer of actual biologists is interesting. They basically say you're not allowed to ask this question, which is also a funny attitude for scientists to take. But anyway, the point is, mathematically, if you want to get a model that has this number close to 0, then you kind of have to change your sort of implicit view of what's happening in evolution. What I've been implicitly using in my model is, in jargon, cladogenesis. So you kind of have about 3 different ideas. Kind of cladogenesis is kind of the idea that new species arise as a daughter species relatively quickly compared to mean species lifetime, and the daughters kind of continue as an existing species, a la brown bear and polar bear. There's an anagenesis idea, which you may recall was basically Darwin's idea, which was that there was a kind of slow accumulation of small changes in a sort of unbroken species line, so that if you could look at the kind of the same species 5 million years apart, and the accumulated changes would be so much that you'd sort of identify it, you'd regard it as a different species, but somehow it had continuously changed into a different species slowly, as distinct from a new species arising quickly in cladogenesis. And of course, there are sort of infinite numbers of variations of this. One can also think of the mechanism as, instead of, one can think of a mechanism of having daughter species, but having the daughter species then replace the parental species, and this is somehow somewhere between the two possibilities, because it's kind of hard to distinguish between a daughter species that displaces the parental species. Well, in what sense is that different from just a change in one species slowly? Okay, so this is the sort of first 3 of my 5 issues. The sort of second part of my talk is, again, some more elaborate math and maybe some more vague biology questions to do with this issue that for distant past fossil data, you can't really resolve it down to a species level. So you're always dealing with data on genera, families, whatever. And the issues here have nothing to do with arguments about should you replace the traditional hierarchy by phylocode or something that's explicitly tree-based, because you have the same issue that to understand the big picture, you're having to somehow pick out clades as representative. Anyway, so for no particular reason, one of my favorite little phylogenetic trees, this is a tree on about 340 recognized genera of dinosaurs, and this is a tree someone produced on that. And again, my point is that just this is one of many trees where the leaves ant species. You can't really resolve down to species level very accurately, but they're at the level of genera here. Similarly, let me maybe leave this over here so I can use it later. There are many pictures of the general type. At the top one, showing simultaneously, this is going back to the Cambrian explosions, going back 500 million years, time series of families or genera. As you probably know, the most complete biological record is the shelly marine invertebrates. I kind of picture as shrimp and mussels and things you see at the seashore. And that there's this type of picture of the time series where you can see some of the mass extinctions as noticeable drops here. But again, my point is that one has this sort of time series data, but it's not resolved down to the species level. Fossil horses, there's a book called Fossil Horses that I've taken this from, have been, they're one of the kind of clades that have been studied in greatest depth, partly because just horses are just sort of historically interesting to people, and partly because they evolved in North America and so gave American paleontologists sort of something to work on at home. This is a sort of slightly old, I mean, maybe if they couldn't get grants to go to the Gobi Desert, or didn't want to go to the Gobi Desert, to most of you, that sort of picture, kind of fossil horse genera will look old-fashioned. This is a similar picture that's oriented right, drawn as a cladogram. Just to make the observation, most of you are working on algorithms whose output is going to be something like that, and if your intended audience is a human being rather than a computer, isn't it actually easier to understand pictures that are drawn like this than pictures that are drawn like that? Just throw that out for your consideration. Yeah, so these are, again, I just threw that in to be annoying. But here's another of my favorite kind of phylogenetic trees of all. So this is a very rare example. So we're now sort of focusing in. This is the sort of North American horses. The time scale runs back 19 million years at the bottom to sort of 12 billion years at the top. But this is one of the very few contexts where people have tried to resolve really down to the species level. And so then this is done by a sort of hardcore data person. I mean, the old joke about mammalian evolution is teeth begetting teeth, so that they're looking at the very detailed fossil structure and trying to sort of analyze what's going on there. And this is someone who's not sort of wedded to any of the sort of philosophical nonsense about evolution. They're just sort of trying to sort of describe the data as best they can. So they've actually kind of used all these modes of evolution in their picture. The little at symbols are representing kind of conjectured. Again, they're saying this is just their best conjecture for what's going on. So what they're saying here is that there's some fossil record during this time that convinces you that this is a species. There's a fossil record during this time that convinces you this is a species. There's a gap here, but what they've thought is that sort of this species has just turned into this species with a kind of missing link here. So part of the tree is explained that way, and of course the sort of splitting events are the more standard speciation conjectures. So sort of the hardcore data people don't care as much about these sort of philosophical issues, and are sort of willing to kind of just draw the best map that they actually can here. Again, so but almost no kind of fossil data is really resolved to this detail anywhere else. So I'm going to do some math. Our second math paper is a kind of thought experiment for what the relationship between a kind of invisible tree on species is and a sort of visible tree on something like genera. So assuming magically that our sort of dinosaur genera tree was the right one, of course it probably isn't, but if we kind of assume it is, then how does that relate to some sort of invisible tree on species? So we're kind of saying this the other way around. We're taking our previous stochastic model at the species level, and we want to build on top of that a model for genera. And I'm going to kind of not say exactly what I'm doing, but show it via a little picture. And I'm going to have to point to things. Let's go here. So here's a kind of hypothetical tree over here on 6 extant and 16 extinct species. Of course, in reality, you wouldn't know all of this, but I'm kind of doing this rather hypothetical exercise. So I want to think of different ways that someone might have divided these 22 species into genera. And the underlying idea is that occasionally we see a new species in jargon, a new type species, a new species that has some noticeable, radically different feature, which is inherited in descendant species. So I'm just imagining this has just happened just twice here, once with this species. So all these have a distinctive feature, once in this single species, which has a distinctive feature. So how can you use that data to sort of define genera and thereby draw a tree on genera? Of course, the first way you think of is, well, all these 4 species have the same feature, so let's make them a 4-species clade. This one thing has a distinctive feature, so let's make it a 1-species genus, and then put everything else in a other category. So that's the easiest thing to do, but of course there are sort of disadvantages of this, that sort of now I have kind of H is close to I, and R is relatively close to S, and yet H and R are put together here, even though H is really close to I. So there's a very naive way of sort of just grouping things according to sort of one noticeable feature kind of works, and it may be that when you don't have much data, you can't do any better than this, but it's sort of unsatisfactory in some theoretical way. At the other extreme, you can try and make your genera classification be sort of as consistent with pure cladistics as you can. That is, you'd like your genera to be clades in the sense of being monophyletic, etc. And more pedantically, you'd like to say, well, whenever I have two species in one genus and a third species in a different genus, you can't have this third species more closely related to one of these than these 2 are related to each other. So you can write down some condition like that, and a kind of stringent condition gives us what I'm calling fine genera that look like this. And again, this is the closest you can get in this world to kind of insisting that genera are monophyletic clades. So these are kind of 2 extremes, a kind of coarsest way of doing things and a finest sensible way of doing things. There's a more mathematical way of looking at this. So a more mathematical way of looking at this is say, well, I got some way of dividing species into genera, so I then want to draw a tree on genera. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to choose one representative species for each genus and draw the tree on those representative species. And now, by golly, I'd like the shape of that tree to not depend on which representative species I draw for each genus. Again, that's a kind of cute sort of structural property for a mathematician, and it turns out that this is sort of different from the other 2 methods of doing it, and it's sort of intuitively sort of somewhere between the 2 in terms of how large or small genera are, and again we call this a medium-sized genera, and in this particular context it gives a split like this. And again, this is okay. So we end up with 3 different logical rules And they're all based on the same data, which is a sort of phylogenetic tree on species and an identification of some of the species as new type species where the type is preserved under descent. But there are different sort of logical rules, there are sort of algorithms for producing these, different algorithms which kind of correspond to different abstract and reasonable abstract criteria for doing things. All in all, it's kind of like the famous, well-known voting scheme issue. You can write down 3 sort of desirable properties that you want voting schemes to have, and then you can prove that there's no voting scheme that has all 3 of them. And so these are sort of based on different choices of 2 out of 3 desirable criteria for genera schemes that you'd like. So we're ultimately going to get a model for doing things with genera, which has our species model. It has a parameter theta, where we're just assuming randomly that each species has chance theta of being a new type. And then we have one of these sort of logical deterministic species, one of these sort of logical and deterministic procedures for actually defining genera here. And, okay, I'm going to ignore some slides for a while. And what do we get to? What do we get to is, so what we get to is now a lot of math questions to ask. I mean, there's some number, our paper on the species level tree, there's some number of interesting statistics you might study for a random tree. Arbitrarily, I've chosen 10. So at the species level, you can sort of think about finding formulas for your distributions for your 10 favorite statistics for a phylogenetic tree. In our world, this is multiplied a lot because there are kind of 3 different features. We have sort of 3 different schemes for defining genera, which is a factor of 3. Secondly, there's a difference between studying extant clades and extinct clades, just because, again, in David Raup's phrase, the pull of the recent, just the size biasing effect of being alive just changes the statistical properties of a clade between extant and extinct. And thirdly, there are actually once you start talking about genera, there are 2 trees you can think of. The more interesting one is the tree whose leaves are genera. The slightly more subtle issue is that you now have the tree of species within a typical genus, and of course, what a tree on a genus of 23 species is logically different from a tree on a clade of 23 species, because you've used some rules for picking out some clades to be genera, and there's a sort of subtle statistical effect there. Of course, in the real world, this is probably a small effect, but at least it's a logically possible effect. So if you think about all these combinations, there are about 120 things we'd like math formulas for, which is kind of silly. When we sort of thought about this, so we spent some time just playing around. Our second paper is sort of explaining all this setup and rather haphazardly finding a few, churning out a few formulas we can by slightly elaborate generating function arguments. And this is more that we didn't. We knew eventually we'd have to resort to simulation, but as a sort of pure math macho, we said, well, first we're going to find some formulas, and we're kind of just resorting immediately to simulations. Are we men or are we mice kind of thing here. Anyways, where is all this going? My last few minutes here. If you look at the tree of life, the Tree of Life web project, and if you sort of go back a long way, this is to the split between living amphibians and other land vertebrates. Everything else here is extinct. There's a split down here. So basically, you see an awful lot of cladograms that look like this, with the comb shape of successive things peeling off. And now the issue is, sort of firstly, is this true? Is this just some artifact of not really knowing the relationship between these things? So is this right? And secondly, does it mean anything? It's very tempting to sort of read significance into this, that sort of these were sort of nature's tries, that sort of things that weren't very successful, and everything else was sort of more fit here. It's almost impossible sort of not to do that sort of interpretation. But again, could this be consistent with just chance? And so a way of saying that, of course, these are large groups, is that underneath this is some tree at the species level. So the question is, could a sort of ordinary, comparatively balanced tree on species level end up looking like this when you go to higher order taxa? And what you see in this little example is that depending on exactly how you define genera, it genuinely can. This is a fairly balanced tree, but this fine genera system, just by the logic of what you're doing, which is kind of hard to explain in a few minutes, but just the logic of trying to be compatible with having only monophyletic clades, it just forces you to have these small groups splitting off one after another, so that this sort of thing is actually completely compatible with a more balanced tree on species, but it's just because you're sort of being pedantic about defining these higher order groups to try and make them monophyletic here, but it's not actually telling you anything about what's happening at a species level. On the other hand, that's only if sort of people are kind of doing genera this way, and if people are doing genera in the other ways, then a kind of a balanced-ish species tree would end up as a sort of balanced-ish genera tree, etc. So it's kind of, we don't get a definite answer here, and that it depends sort of not only on what the unknown species tree is, but it also depends on kind of exactly what biologists are doing when they're defining these higher order groups. So that's one thing, and my final thing, which I'm just going to it kind of has to do with that type of picture up here. Another sort of famous evolutionary biologist, Jablonski. I found this quote from it, and the background here, of course, is historically the paleontologists have been sensitive to the criticism that, well, the fossil record is very incomplete, and therefore none of your data makes any sense. So they've been sort of fighting that for many years, and so what this phrase means is that kind of pictures like this, so that this is the complex trajectory of taxonomic diversity is exactly this sort of thing, and you have different sources of data. It's kind of like global warming. You have all sorts of different sources of data, but they're claiming they're more or less consistent. But then you have this sort of slightly hard to interpret sentence here that sort of when you look at the data at, again, different taxonomical levels, there's some variability in how things should fluctuate. So the issue is somehow what is when you kind of compare different levels, genera and families. There's a data question, how much these fluctuate, and then the issue is sort of what whether that means anything kind of depends on a model for what you'd expect to be happening sort of just by chance in a pure chance model. So we now have a pure chance model that tells us what these relative fluctuation rates should be in the absence of any biological effect. And we haven't quite figured out how to study this. It's a sort of complicated thing we have to study by simulation, and we haven't done the work. But this gives us sort of a math toolkit for kind of giving sort of theoretical giving kind of simulations of theoretical processes and measuring fluctuation quantities, and in principle we can compare with actual data if I found somebody who understood the data well enough to do that. So I'm going to stop talking there. Thank you very much.
I don't want to question all the time, but if nobody else. I just wonder, there was this top East German geologist, he died just recently, 80 years old or so, who tried also to, from the, not molecular, only from fossil data, to find out how many species or genera or families were in one group
Right.
at a given point of time, and he
Right.
published many tables, also many books on this.
Okay.
Generally, he finds that if something new comes in that is successful, there will be many different types of genera, families,
Right.
species within that new group that is founded by this new thing,
Right.
and it remains stable, and then it goes back,
Right.
sort of reclines, maybe to zero, like the dinosaurs, or
Right.
not quite to zero, but like the frogs or whatever.
Right.
And did you ever see this work?
I haven't, but I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, the more modern stuff is Sepkoski in America and what's his name in Bristol. You know, there are two people who have kind of very, you know, who kind of gone through the library and have very detailed kind of statistical data here. I mean, I'm sure it's in the same general spirit as your East German. I just, yeah, that may be in a previous generation. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just two quick questions, David. Halfway through your talk, you put up this nice formula for this probability of the number of past species being
Right.
1/r. Is that asymptotic in the end, or is
That actually is exact in, you know, of course, the right things in integer value, but yeah, it's an exact formula, and it's just a sort of nice feature of our model. Basically, because the sort of number of it just happens, and this of course isn't built in. It just happens. A lot of the number of species alive in reverse time is just a martingale. So.
The other question is, in your model, you have this uniform prior. Would it make much difference if you assume the time of origin was? I mean, obviously, it can't be older than the Earth, and
Right,
you
yeah,
had some
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
some sort of normal distribution or whatever, some time in the past.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So obviously, I'm cheating a bit, and of course, some of the sort of I've emphasized the variability of realizations, and of course, some of that is coming precisely from the fact that you know, I've taken this uniform on sort of 0 to -infinity prior, which, and of course, as you say, you know, in any concrete example, you have fossil record, you have other evidence which probably pinpoints the founding of the clade to some interval, which is probably only a sort of factor of 2 between the beginning and the end. So that would certainly cut down on the variability somewhat. But just because, you know, it just makes any formulas just become much harder when you do that. So, yeah.
I thought it was a sacrilege to ask a mathematical question in such a beautiful talk, but Mike saved me because my question was related to that, about the distribution, that question that you had. I can see that if you have a Brownian motion, let's say, that starts from x, and time it hits 0, you stop it there, and you take x over the maximum that is uniformly distributed, right? Is that related to such a...
Right, our model is just sort of a kind of random walk, or I mean, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of the discrete version of the Feller process. Just yeah.
I mean, for Brownian motion, it is exact.
Right, it's exact for any skip-free process. Just the fact that you go up and down one is what makes it exact.
I use it as an exercise when I did
Right. Very good.
Good. I have motivation now.
Very good.
All right, maybe further questions could be addressed later at tea time, but let's thank the speaker again.